So if you find this sleep story helpful or interesting, then give it a thumbs up, leave any comments that you've got below, and if you aren't already, subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon so you can receive notifications of when future sleep stories go live. I have dozens and dozens of stories already on my channel that you can go and search. I also release new stories every single week, so I hope you enjoy this story. So take a moment to allow your eyes to close and allow yourself to begin to relax. And as you begin to relax, I'm just going to tell this sleep meditation in the background. And it's a sleep meditation about a man who wakes up one day to the sound of the grandfather clock downstairs chiming at 8 a.m. And every morning, with the sound of that chiming, he gets up, he gets straight out of bed, and he heads downstairs. And as he heads downstairs, so he hears the ticking of that grandfather clock. And he always tries to get downstairs near the clock before all 8 chimes have sounded. And then he walks through to the kitchen. He makes himself a drink and some breakfast. And he likes to jump straight up out of bed, feeling alert and awake, because he knows that when he was younger, he used to sleep through alarms and used to allow himself to drift and float deeper asleep when an alarm sounded. He would just reach over, turn it off, roll over, and fall back asleep. So now he has his routine, where he wakes straight up, leaves bed, walks downstairs, and makes sure that way he doesn't go back to bed and lie down. And for breakfast he always looks in the cupboards to see what he can have today. And he'll sometimes have toast with a different spread, other times pancakes, other times cereal. Then he unlocks the back door, walks outside the back of his house, breathes in the fresh morning air, feels that air as it passes in through his nose, down into his lungs, almost feeling it passing through his body. He turns to face the sun, even on cloudy days, closes his eyes and allows the warmth of the sun to begin to wake up his body clock. He has a drink and then heads back inside. Heads through to the living room, where he often finds his dog just lying there sleeping in the corner of the living room. He sometimes thinks that his dog's lazier than he is, and seems to want to sleep more than he wants to sleep. And so he goes over, he pets the dog, he sees the dog move around, and he swears that he notices the dog's eyes close tighter almost as if the dog is trying to say, "Don't wake me up. I want to sleep." Then he starts tickling the dog. And then the dog always wakes up and joins in and has fun with him. And they sit and play for a while, before he then heads out on a walk with his dog. And when he leaves his house to go on a walk, he walks down the street, turns into a park, and as he walks through the park, so he can notice other dog walkers, some being far more active than he is. And at the other side of the park, there's a footpath that leads down to the beach. And so he cuts through that footpath, cuts through the overhanging trees, the rustling leaves, noticing the colours of those trees, the brown of the bark, the green of the leaves, the crunching of each footstep that he takes. Before it opens up to a beautiful sandy beach. He then lets that dog off of the leash, and the dog rushes around, runs down to the sea, instantly just leaps a wave and splashes down through another wave, and then runs and splashes, jumping waves, trying to bite waves, rolling in the water, before running back out onto the sand and rolling in the sand. And the man throws a ball a few times, and the dog runs after it and brings it back. And to the man, he's just having a leisurely stroll, while his dog is just rushing around, using so much energy. He's always surprised how much energy the dog seems to use, given how lethargic the dog seems when they're at home. And as they walk along the beach, so they can see a father and a child building the most grand sandcastle. They've dug a moat all the way from the seashore, sloping down, guiding that water down that channel and around this grand castle. They've managed to fashion sand bridges over that water. And they've obviously used many buckets of sand to carefully build up that sand castle. And now they're going around that sand castle, carefully smoothing the edges, carefully smoothing the turrets, just making it just right. And just as that father and child step away from the sandcastle to admire it, and the father gets his phone out to take a photo of the sandcastle and his child smiling next to it, and the dog leaps in the air, turns his back to the sandcastle to catch the flying ball, and skids straight through the sandcastle, rolling down the other side, and then proudly displaying the ball in its teeth. And the man was really distressed and upset and worried about what they might think, and runs over to apologize. But as he gets there, so he notices the father laughing so hard, and that the child looks sad, but the father is laughing so hard. And the man runs over, saying, "Sorry, sorry, sorry," and is really apologetic. And the man turns his phone to the other man and shows the photo that he got of the dog with the most weird expression, reaching for the ball, cheeks flared open, some saliva going everywhere, legs flailing, with a cloud of sand spraying up from the sandcastle. And this man just thought this was the funniest photo. And when he showed it to his son couldn't help but keep laughing as well, and couldn't be angry at the dog when it came up, dropped the ball at his feet, and started knocking its head against the child's leg, and wrapping itself around the child's legs, wanting to play. And the father said that it's fine. It's only sand. They can rebuild it. That what's been created here is greater than the sandcastle. It's a memory that won't be forgotten. It's something that probably will never happen again. That they'll probably come to the beach, they'll probably build multiple sandcastles. But now when they do that, they'll laugh and remember that time the dog flew through the castle. And they have the photo to prove it. They'll be able to tell the mother what happened and show the photo. They'll be able to tell friends, family. And all these people will laugh. And so that one event, that chance random event, will bring happiness and joy to so many people. Even though on the surface, the first reaction was that something that was worked so hard for was destroyed. And the man asked if he could be sent a copy of the photo, that he'd like to be able to print it off. And the father said that would be fine. And the man apologised again about the sandcastle, and carried on walking along the beach with his dog. And while walking along, he was sure that his dog had a smug smile. But he felt that dogs shouldn't be able to have smug smiles. He just felt that the way that dog was walking and looking, he knew the dog knew what it had done. And even though the father and the child were okay with what had happened, he still felt a bit guilty about it. And he still wanted to tell the dog off, but at the same time couldn't bring himself to do so. Because when he looked at his dog's face, he would just smile. And he couldn't be mad at him. And so they carried on walking along the beach, And from time to time that dog ran down into the water, splashed around, tried to eat the waves, leapt over some, dived through others, seemed to always want to roll in the sand when it came out of the water, rather than just shaking itself off to dry itself off. And he was sure the dog did that again, just to be cheeky, knowing that it made him all dirty, and that when he then shakes himself off, it makes everyone jump back. And a little way along the path, they turned up from the beach, down another footpath, through into some more woodland. And they wandered through this woodland, gradually weaving up through the woodland, up a slight hill, until they came out into a meadow up on top of a hill. And up here on this meadow, they could see a myriad of flowers and grasses all blowing in the breeze. They could see down over a small village, could feel the warmth of the sun, notice clouds in the sky. And the man took this moment to just place his coat on the ground and then sit on his coat and rest back on his arms. And he just rested there looking out over the meadow while his dog wandered round, sniffing at the plants, following scents that are unseen, jumping, rolling around, and then occasionally just lying down for a little bit and resting also. And while he rested there, he watched as swallows darted around in the sky, as some birds of prey circled high overhead, as the occasional dragonfly darted into view, hovered, and then made impossible seeming manoeuvres, jetting off in different directions, and could hear that wind blowing gently across the meadow, watching butterflies land on different flowers, having a drink, and then flying off to another flower, and bees going from plant to plant, and just relaxing and being in the moment, being out in nature. And while he rested here, he got his phone out and started reading a book on his phone. And he was a little way through this book. And as he read this book, so he began to get drawn into the story. Drawn into a story about someone in space, circling the Earth in a shuttle. And part-way round the Earth, the shuttle encountered an anomaly, and as it passed through that anomaly, it vanished. And as it vanished, it reappeared elsewhere in the past. And it was still on its same journey around the Earth. It's just the Earth below wasn't at the same time as it was moments earlier. And the people on the shuttle suddenly lost contact with the ground control. And they couldn't hear anything. They couldn't pick up any signals coming from the planet below. They couldn't detect anything else in orbit with them. And they had to start working at trying to solve this problem, trying to work out what happened and how they can get back to their present time. And 90 minutes later, suddenly they encountered the anomaly again in space. They passed through that anomaly again. And as they did, the Earth below seemed to change again. It was as if they perhaps had gone back in time even further. And they realized that this anomaly seems to be transporting them back through time. And so they had to figure out how they could head through the anomaly the opposite direction. But they knew that they couldn't just fire thrusters, turn around and fly back the other way, because they're travelling thousands of miles an hour in one direction. But they need to know exactly where the anomaly is. And so they work out a way of just subtly changing their orbit, so that the next time round they just miss the anomaly. And when they go round again, they're a few degrees further out of line with the anomaly. And over a number of weeks, they circle the Earth below, each time moving a few degrees, until eventually they're facing the opposite direction, and now they're going to be coming at that anomaly from the opposite route. And this time, as they pass through the anomaly, the planet below transforms back to how it was before. And then 90 minutes later, when they pass through the anomaly again, it transforms again. And they can suddenly hear ground control, they can suddenly hear and pick up other transmissions and recognize other stuff in space with them. And then they have a dilemma. Do they go through the anomaly to see if it'll take them into the future, knowing how hard it is to turn around and go back through again? Or do they just steer now to avoid the anomaly, warn others about this anomaly here, and then just carry out their normal mission and return to Earth as planned? And they decide that they're going to tell the ground control what has occurred. Share everything they know with ground control. And tell them that they're going to fly through the anomaly again. That they know there's a risk. And so they don't know how far they travel, one direction or the other. They couldn't work out exactly how far into the past they had travelled, so they don't know exactly how far into the future they'll travel. But they tell ground control that if this works and they end up in the future, just to be prepared, to make sure that there's an alert that's permanently, from this point forth, on every mission log, that something could come from this direction until that event has occurred, to make sure that when they pass through the anomaly, there shouldn't be anything on the other side directly in line with them. And then, at the end of the 90 minutes, they pass through that anomaly. And they come out in the distant future. They see a giant hovering space station that looks like it's tethered, like a giant hammer tethered to the Earth. They can see lights zipping up and down from the Earth up to that space station, and from the space station down to the Earth. And they can see different kinds of lights. Lights going up and down, almost like a lift in a tube. And then there's larger circles or donut shapes that seem to be rising up, carrying more stuff up to that space station before lowering back down again. And not long after they pass through and come out in the future, and they receive a message telling them how far they've travelled into the future, telling them that people have been ready and waiting and avoiding the anomaly through time, and that they already knew when they were going to appear, because they made it back safely and were able to report back when they had appeared and what had happened. And so although they don't know right now what happened, there is a report existing of what happened that they wrote. And they find this a really unusual concept, to know that there's a document that they wrote saying what their entire experience was here that they've not yet had, and explaining the exact time that they've arrived that they don't yet know, that was shared because they know they make it safely back, but they don't know yet that they are going to make it safely back. And they get told that here, now, it's so far in the future that it's easy for their shuttle to have some small, unmanned drones put alongside it. And they'll fire thrusters in different directions that can help the shuttle turn around and face back to the anomaly, without it having to repeatedly circle the Earth, gradually changing direction. And so they talk about this time period without revealing much about the technologies other than what they can see from the shuttle. And they share how far in the future this is. And the astronauts are impressed with how much will be achieved and pleased that something gets achieved. And they have a mission here, something they can do that others can't, because others have developed thinking styles that have stopped them thinking quite so basic. And yet these astronauts from the past think far more basic. And so there's certain problem solving that they do well. And so they help these future people with that before heading back home. And as they head back home, and the story reaches a natural point to stop reading, that man drifts out of the story and back to the meadow. And back in the meadow, he glances over to his dog, makes sure the dog is still behaving and still there. He listens to those rustling leaves of the trees. And after a little bit, he stands up, walks through the meadow, whistles for his dog, who comes running over, bounding across the meadow. And they walk down the hill, down that meadow, down towards that village down there. And as they near the village, so they wander into a pedestrianised street with some nice quaint shops on either side, and the smells of the butchers, of the bakers, and the other smells of florists, the market, the sounds of church bell ringing at the end of the village. Heading down and over a bridge, over a river, following that riverbank. And while following that riverbank, the man often does this walk and heads to where he grew up as a child, to some woodland he used to play in. And he arrives at that bit of woodland just off the riverbank, walks into the woods, and he can see his zipwire that he built years earlier, that he connected to trees up high on the hills, all the way down to the trees at the bottom of the hills. And it was made out of wire, and it's been there for decades. And he knows that children frequently stumble across this and then use it, and sometimes you have to remove some branches that have crossed the path of the zipwire. But it doesn't take a lot of effort, and then you can use it. And so he pulls it all the way to the top, with his dog following him all the way up to the top of the hill. And the zip wire has a small bit of wood to sit on. He places that between his legs, jumps up, lifts his legs up, and feels the bounce of the wire as he lands back onto the seat, and the pulley travels down that wire, hitting a rubber tyre at the end, throwing him up in the air a little bit, before bouncing him back a little bit away from that tree. And he feels as exhilarated now doing this as he used to as a child. And he does that a few more times, recapturing his youth in his mind. And he's pleased that something he put together so many years ago is still here and still able to be used and still able to bring fun to many people. And as it zips down the hill, the dog often chases after him, barking and panting, and then skidding to a halt as he suddenly stops at the bottom. And then he continues his walk. He often follows this path down the river, down to the second bridge, crosses that bridge, and walks back up the other side of the river, almost like walking in a large circle. He finds not only is this good for giving his dog a walk and giving him some exercise, but it also helps with his mental health and helps to make sure that he gets some fresh air, and he finds many needs met from this walk, where he wanders through countryside down to the beach, and through countryside he stops and reads and relaxes for a while, then recaptures some childhood memories before continuing his walk along the river, over the bridge and back up the other side of the river, following that other side of the river, and then over another bridge, and then heading back towards the woodland. And as he heads back towards the woodland, he passes under a silver arch sculpture, and on top of that silver arch sculpture is what looks like a silver jet plane. And out the back of that silver jet plane is a silver trail heading down, joining with the top of the arch, and then passing off the side of the arch, almost as if that jet has flown towards the arch, turned up to avoid the arch, and just skimmed the tip of the arch, almost as if it's barely touching the silver arch itself. And it's been sculpted with so much detail and so much movement in its work that it just looks like it could have been flying right there. And it seems to be barely touching that arch, so much so that you could almost be convinced, if you just glanced, that it was something flying past an arch, almost like it's defying gravity over the arch, where the point of contact between the trail from behind the jet and the point not even on the top of the arch but just near the side of it just makes contact, doesn't look enough contact to hold the weight of that jet. and he always walks through the arch and has this sense of the importance of this arch to this area, to those who have fought in many conflicts and are being remembered. And so he feels that it's important to walk through that arch. And that fighter he always thinks of as looking like it's trying to do a victory lap in the sky, as if it's circling around and releasing some smoke behind it in celebration. Like the end of some difficult times. And he continues along that path into the woodland. As he walks into the woodland, so he notices this part of the woodland is deeper and denser. Sound is more muffled, and the rustling of the leaves overhead take on a slightly deeper tone. And it's darker in this part of the woodland. And even less breeze can make it into the woodland here. And so he feels a deeper sense of peace, a deeper sense of solitude, a greater opportunity to think about things and process things in his mind as he walks through this part of the woodland. And this is his healing journey, this is his healing walk that he makes every day, where anything playing on his mind when he gets to here, this is when he takes his time to think about it, to process that, so that when he arrives home, he can arrive home clear-headed. He can arrive home leaving anything he doesn't want to arrive home with behind him, where here he can process those things. And as he walks through here, so his mind wanders and starts processing. He starts to have a sense of pacing in a measured way through a Zen garden. He can notice the peace. He can notice the rhythm. He can notice the order in this garden, and notice the way that as sand is raked, so order can be created. Knots in life can be undone. And as stones are placed strategically, they can have tremendous meaning. Meaning what stone and where, and then how it's placed. And then sitting on a large black stone, carefully reached, walking across sand, raking behind where you're walking. As he sits, crosses his legs on that stone, in his mind's eye, And take some deep, purposeful breaths, breathing out longer than breathing in, being present and in the moment, being aware of where he is, aware of where sounds are, almost like making time here stand still. And as he's aware of here and his eyes close, it's as if his eyes are open, as if he's got a third eye that can see when his eyes are shut. That can see a representation of the world around him as he rises outside of himself and can see himself sat there meditating, rising above himself, seeing mountains in the distance and floating as a mind to the mountains, floating, drifting through space and time over to those mountains, and settling down in front of a cave high up in the mountains, perched just in the entrance of a small cave, just big enough to camp in, and thinking about a fire outside that cave, and seeing a small wood campfire appear, and thinking about something comfortable to wrap up, snuggle down in, and noticing that appear, the most comfy, fluffy blankets that he wraps around himself as he sits in the entrance to that cave, hearing the wind whistle with the most beautiful note behind him and back out of that cave past his ears, and that crackling of the fire while he gazes down and can see himself sat all the way over there in the distance in the Zen garden, and can see everything in between, and can recognize this as his mind, where the connection between the him walking through the woods and him up here in this mountain is that him down there in the Zen garden, where here he can look down and survey his mind, surveying a metaphorical landscape of his mind, all the worries, darkness, all the light and pleasures, and everything in between. And from up here, just like controlling a lucid dream, or programming a computer game, he can work on programming and influencing the landscape below from this position up high above that landscape, from this relaxed, calm position, rewinding areas of darkness to bring light and comfort, adding more light and movement and excitement to other areas, creating easy paths through woodland, through dense forest to areas of pleasure and happiness. And making forest thicker and harder to travel through to areas of pain, to areas that it's preferable not to travel to. While seeing the animals in the forest, seeing the animals in the rivers, seeing the birds overhead, working in harmony with this world, seeing the plants, the trees, all working in harmony, that even those dark forests, those dark areas, become brighter and more appealing as time goes on, as that work continues, as they get tended to by animals. And then up here, they have a sense of relaxing by this fire and drifting into their own deep meditation, almost like a deep spiritual meditation that this person up here is having, connecting with the world around them, being able to lower their hands down to the ground beneath them, and as those hands touch the ground, so they feel a deep connection, almost like their hands and the ground beneath them become one and fuse on some level. As a purple, healing glow spreads out through every atom of this land from those hands, even spreading into the sky, beginning to give the sky a slight purple tinge. And then as the fire burns down to embers, so they have a sense of opening their eyes and launching from the cave and flying back to that them in the Zen garden, and then leaving that Zen garden and finding themselves reaching the end of the woods, walking out of those woods with their dog alongside them, heading out of the woods, following that path, past a park, seeing some children playing, back towards the street, on the way home, and then arriving home, the dog feeling satisfied with the long walk, instantly going in and lying back down in bed. The man going in, hearing the ticking of that grandfather clock, and seeing that it's now 11 o'clock, and a couple of hours have passed since waking up. And making a drink and sitting down in the back garden to relax briefly before carrying on with the day. And then on this day, they carry out a few chores. They lead a normal day, They grab some lunch. They watch some TV in the afternoon. They spend a lot of time in their garden. And they do a bit of gardening. And they see what looks like a diamond hanging on a thread from a tree at the end of the garden, just gently spinning at the end of the garden. They head down to that diamond. They don't know whether it's a diamond or not, or whether it's just another crystal. But they spin it in their hand, and as they do, they see rainbow shards of light dance from that crystal as the sun catches it while it spins. And while that happens, so the tree appears to move. And as that tree moves, they find a portal opening up. And they're curious what's happening, but comfortable as well. And they walk through the portal. And as they walk through that portal, so they descend some steps. They walk down those steps, and as they walk deeper down the steps, they realize that there's some secret place here under the end of their garden. They realize that that tree has never been a real tree. But they don't remember seeing that crystal hanging from the tree before. And they don't know why turning that crystal and having that light reflect off it has opened this portal, opened this pathway. And they realize that deep under where they live, there seems to be a whole other world, a whole secret area, like a civilization living under a civilization. And they can see animals and trees. They can see what looks like people. And they go to talk to some of these people. And they find out that this area was built many decades earlier, when there was conflict in this area. And they thought that the conflict may not go in their favour. And so they had built this area. They'd built some secret ways down into this area. And ever since, it's been kept active. And many of these people down here are scientists, military personnel. And they can see what looks like the most incredible aeroplanes. And they talk about how there's tunnels going off many miles that head out to cliffs that can launch these planes through fake cliffs if needed. And that they do so when testing those planes at times. And they say that they're going to have to wipe the mind of this person. And he doesn't want his mind wiped. And they tell him that if he can be of help to them, then his mind won't have to be wiped. If he agrees to continue to keep it a secret, and perhaps even work with them on some of their projects. And they hand him a box, and they tell him, if you can access that box, we won't wipe your mind. And they explain that it takes a lot of training and knowledge to be able to access that box, to know what the right pattern is and to recognize the kind of pattern. And while they're telling him this, and he's watching and listening to them, his hands absent-mindedly ping open the box to reveal a golden key. And he takes that key and they're surprised at how fast he managed to access that box that others take years of training. They then take him to a building and tell him that if he can make his way round the maze in this building, blindfolded, then he can prove himself and open the door with the key at the other end of the maze. And so he walks into the maze blindfolded, and he puts his left hand on the nearest wall, and he starts walking. And he walks and he walks, keeping his left hand on the wall. And he doesn't take his left hand off of the wall, and he walks and he walks and he walks until he finds the exit. And he uses the key, opens the door, and even through his blindfold, he can notice the bright light. And he takes off the blindfold, and he sees the most incredible sight. What looks like a vast UFO in a highly illuminated room. And the person that saw him into the maze is stood there, surprised that he'd managed to navigate a maze blindfolded. And he said that it's easy. I just kept my hand on the wall. And they say there'll definitely be a position for you here. That we're working on incredible things for the future. And they asked what he does currently, and he explains that he walks his dog, that he reads, that he learns and studies the world, that he gets lost in thought and fantasies, and that he sees the world differently to most others. He sees beauty and wonder, but at the same time gets surprised and down because of his overthinking. And he explains that he used to be a musician, but he lost all confidence. And so he still makes some money from his music that's out there, but doesn't really do anything else with his life. He's felt lost. He's felt without a purpose for a while. And he's wondered what that purpose would end up being, what would give him new purpose, what would give him a challenge and something to work for. And now this opportunity has presented itself. And they're quick to hire someone who thinks how he thinks. And he gets shown back out of this base. And it just happens that that portal to here is in his garden. And he'd never noticed it until today. He'd never discovered that portal, even though it was always there. And as the sun sets, so he settles down for the evening before heading to bed, wrapping himself up comfortably under his quilt, sinking his head deep into the pillow, and drifting and floating into the most beautiful dream, and then on into the most healing, deep sleep, sleeping well through the night.